Thanks for visiting our office.
It's a pleasure.
Highly appreciated. A few years ago, when we connected, you wrote to me about your vision on gazelles.
That's
You
right.
talked about 100 SMEs, who are fast growing, and you wanted to focus the government's attention on that. So,
I think we had some success in the
yes,
sense that the establishment of the British Business Bank, which is something I launched in the
yes,
government, did help make, things like the peer-to-peer lending market that didn't exist, were created, and it gave an opportunity for those rapid growth small companies to get access to finance that they hadn't had. And the other thing we did that was a really good scheme, which was called the Accelerator, which was helping those gazelles upgrade their
yes.
management skills. Unfortunately, this government stopped it. But some of the things that we did, have survived and have made a good contribution.
And actually, we are the direct beneficiaries of your British Bank. So
Good.
one of our investors has been 30% funded by British Bank.
Good.
And so we are talking to them, and we are in advanced conversations. So that's so I can see how that works. Uh, so I basically collected some questions from our various offices, regarding how Brexit would sort of affect the SME businesses. So I've got 5 or 6 questions, if I may. First one is, what is your kind of best case or worst case view of Brexit?
Well, I think some of the more extreme things that people were worrying about 6 months ago are probably now less likely. There was a real worry that we would simply crash out of the European Union next March without any agreements, everything from airlines being disrupted. It could have been a complete catastrophe. But I think that is now very unlikely, and the government has got past the first stage of the negotiation with this so-called transition. Now, so in that situation, the best scenario, from my point of view, would be if we decide through a vote in Parliament or a public vote to stay in the European Union and reverse the decision. That's possible. I would say maybe 30% probability. It could happen.
30%.
Something of that order. But the more likely is that we will leave, and it will be what's called a hard Brexit. In other words, the government will leave the single market with all the rules and regulations around that, but it will leave it gradually through a transition of 21 months. So we're talking effectively about the end of 2020 when we get into this completely new world. And the government is also trying to get us out of what's called the customs union, so that the system of common tariffs in terms of stuff that's brought in from abroad, that would also come to an end at that time. So that's the most likely outcome, and that will be pretty disruptive.
Yeah, I can imagine, because our exchange rate might be affected, and there will be lots of uncertainty about long-term contracts, about import, exports, and all that.
Well, the whole purpose of this so-called transition that the government's negotiated is to give time to sort that out. But the problem is that we don't know what's at the end of the transition, whether it's something a bit like what we have now or whether it's very radically different. And there are certain things that will change. Crucially, for companies that rely on people coming in from overseas, from Europe, which affects some high-tech companies, particularly in the London area, which also affects hospitals, care homes, hospitality industry. These people will not be able to rely on migrant workers in the way they have in the past.
Do you reckon that the migrant workers from East Europe would be replaced by migrant workers who will be given visas coming from other parts of the world?
I don't think so. It's possible, but given that one of the main reasons for Brexit was people's hostility to overseas workers, I can't see how that could happen. I know that there are some people who've been going around promising and saying that, well, okay, if you can't come from Eastern Europe, we'll bring more people from India. Well, I don't think that will happen, actually. I don't think so. So there will be quite a serious tightening of the labour market in areas where we do rely on people from overseas with key skills.
Well, thanks for that. So basically you're saying as a society we'll become more insular.
I'm afraid that is the likely consequence. Yeah.
Okay. So what is your advice to the SMEs, because 2,500 of them are our clients,
Yeah.
so they want to know that what would be the advice from
Well, I think first of
somebody
all, I think first of all, do a bit of scenario planning. It's something I used to do in Shell. Now, Shell was a big global company, but small companies can do the same. You just think about alternative futures and how you deal with it, and whether your business is sufficiently robust to deal with shocks and changes. I think that's the first thing. I think secondly, work through your trade association in order to try to understand how the regulations might change. I mean, we spent as a country 40 years getting used to European regulations. Many of those will remain, but some will change, and it's only when you get down to the kind of nitty-gritty of what's the situation in your particular sector to get an understanding of what the risks are. So I think working through a trade association, getting the latest intel on what they can tell you about what's likely to happen, I think that would be good advice. And I think a third thing would be to think carefully about your supply chain, because even small companies, they're buying things from overseas, or they're part of we've seen with Carillion, if a big operator goes down, it drags a lot of people with it. So think carefully about who you're dependent on in your supply chain and how that might be affected by Brexit.
So one of the questions is, what is your understanding of post-Brexit VAT or tariff regime for companies in the UK who deal with the companies in Europe?
Well, in principle, one of the consequences of Brexit would be that the government will have greater freedom to change VAT rates. At the moment, it's quite difficult. It's possible in some circumstances, but the structure of VAT is fairly set. And it may be, therefore, that products that are currently non-vatable become vatable and so on. I mean, that kind of thing is one of the consequences, but we don't know in detail because the government haven't spelt it out. Now, with tariffs, in other words, the duty you pay on stuff from outside the European Union, now that could change. The key thing to look out for is that in May, probably in May, there will be a vote in Parliament as to whether Britain stays inside a customs union. If we remain in a customs union, then the tariffs are exactly the same as they are today. They wouldn't change. But if the government persists with the idea of taking us out of the customs union, then there's a potential for not just higher or lower tariffs, but for quite a lot of form filling in terms of anything you buy from outside the European Union, so-called rules of origin. It could become quite bureaucratic.
So currently it appears that the political debate is being driven more by emotions rather than facts. Do you agree?
I think that's right. I think this is a phenomenon across the Western world. You see what's happened in America, completely wildly erratic president doing all kind of weird things, but actually pushing the right emotional buttons for his own audience. And we're saying the same thing here to a lesser extent in other Western European countries. And it's very difficult to pin the government down to rational decision making. Occasionally Theresa May says, well, okay, we know Brexit's going to make us worse off, we've just got to live with it, but equally there's a lot of myths and stories, and I can understand if you're trying to run a business on a scientific, professional basis, when there's so much misinformation and myth going around the place, it's quite difficult.
So Brexit is basically an economist's nightmare, right?
Well, certainly a negative, with one or two exceptions. There's a slightly maverick professor in Liverpool who thinks that Brexit will make the country better off, but I think overwhelmingly the economic business consensus is that we will be worse off. Now, it doesn't mean to say that's a complete catastrophe, a falling falling off the edge of the world. I mean, it's or even as bad as 2008 in the financial crisis. But I think what it does mean is that the economy grows a bit more slowly than it would have otherwise done. Therefore, the government gets less tax revenue, so therefore there's continuing pressure on public services and taxation, and it just all becomes a bit more difficult. I mean, that's, I would think, the more probable scenario.
So maybe we have to lose 1 or 2 generations before we
Well,
start
it's possible
growing
that
again.
you know, if things turn out badly, and they probably will, that the younger generation, who overwhelmingly voted to stay, will want to reopen the whole question of membership.
So finally, what do you think a role of accountant can be in helping businesses grow in these uncertain times?
Well, I think people are going to need professional advice. You know, there is so much uncertainty, and to have, you know, an accounting company which is collecting the best intelligence available, thinking about the risks that you may not have otherwise anticipated, I think this is a good prudent step to take. I mean, the accounting profession, in fact, may have some interesting new developments. One of the things I've been campaigning for, and others, is breaking up the big four, because we've got this big monopoly concentration in accounting and audit, and it's possible that, you know, the competition authorities could open up the whole profession and create much more opportunity for newcomers, innovative accounting newcomers, to make a big mark. So I think that if you are a small business, you know, struggling to think about the future, having a good, reliable professional advisor is a necessary discipline.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I tell the SME clients that I meet is, you talked about scenario planning, you know, so scenario planning, modeling, or preparing yourself to do business beyond the borders.
Well, you don't need to have fancy computer-driven things. It's just a sort of applied common sense. But somebody who isn't emotionally tied up with the business and who can step outside and say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And I think that's the kind of discipline you need.